also from DWR, Carl Wilcox from the Department of Fish and Wildlife, and Mike Chakowski from Fish and Wildlife Service. That doesn't sound right. I see someone. I just don't have a car. We've got to have the Bureau, right? And Noah's good, okay.
And I won't be there, but Ron Milligan will from the Bureau.
There you go. So instead of 2 DWRs, that makes sense. Ron, good to see you. I feel like I'm in a card game and I'm missing some of the key, sets. Now, I'm presuming you've all organized yourself, so you're going to tell me what order you're in. So,
yeah. So this is John Lehi with DWR State Water Project Operations, and yes, we're very well organized here. So, I will step in and kind of take the lead here. Just again, to introduce this interagency panel, which constitutes most of the members of the real-time drought operations team, drought operations management team, RT dot, but the M is silent. So this is, the members we have here representing, again, myself, DWR. To my left, your right, Ron Milligan, with Reclamation. I have Mike Chakowski to my right, representing U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Garwin Yip, NOAA Fisheries, and Carl Wilcox with State Fish and Wildlife. Thank you again, Madam Chair Marcus and other distinguished members of the board. So this is our opportunity to give you an update on where we are in the SWP CVP temporary urgency petition process, which includes the drought operations plan. So I'll go ahead and, unless hearing anyone wanting some opening remarks, I will go ahead and walk you through the projects. This presentation will be an update from the project's point of view. So I'll walk you through here. Okay, so what I'd like to do is basically start by updating you on the hydrology and where we've been since we last met with you in February, and how that hydrology has influenced the decisions that have been made over the last couple months. Also like to touch on the actual operations based on the temporary urgency change petition order, provide you with the latest petition requests and how that affects operations moving forward through the summer and into the fall of 2014. So, to begin with, kind of set the stage here, what did the world look like for California water back in January? And so I think you may have remembered this rather terrifying plot that we presented back in January. This was the precipitation, historical precipitation for the Northern Sierra 8 Station Index, which is the bulk of the water supply for both Central Valley Project and State Water Project. And as you could see, as of that time in late January, in the far lower left-hand corner was where we were as far as this year's total, which was 3.5 inches. And typically at that point in time, we're about halfway through our supply for the year. And you can see where we were in relation to the rest of the years, the two outlier years, which were the 1977-1924 drought. And so we were basically in a position for a drought of biblical proportions, potentially. And so what our forecasts were, operations forecasts were showing at that time were typically we'll look at, a dry condition, the 90%, and the median condition from that point forward, 50%. So basically what our 90% forecasts were indicating is that we would essentially be depleting the major reservoir storages, and we would have an inability to prevent salinity intrusion from into the delta. And so that would represent the world prior to the project's construction of the major dams in the system. And so, this is taken from the Delta Atlas, shows the pre-1944 years and the salinity intrusions that occurred during the drier years, the 1930s most principally, and 1924. Under median conditions from that point on, it would still be a very dry year, but it would resemble a situation where we could still control the salinity intrusion. So those bookends are part of our typical planning process for operations. So, because of the devastating consequences associated with the potential 90% exceedance, we did prepare for the worst. And so starting, we had the governor's drought proclamation in the middle of January. We put forth our initial urgency change petition at the end of January, was that 29th? We also announced reductions in allocations for both water service contractors for the projects and for settlement contractors at that point in time. As I said, we did petition the board for modified Delta standards at that point in time. And we started the planning process for emergency drought barrier installation if needed under this drier scenario. And we began development generally on a drought operations plan. So initially, the petitions before the board were kind of on a month-to-month basis, but we wanted to take a more comprehensive view in the drought operations plan, which was put forth in early April, to cover, the remainder of the year through middle of November, rather than take it a month-to-month type for February, March. So in February and March, we did see substantial improvements in hydrology, at least for the Sacramento, for the 8-station Northern Sierra. We saw above average precipitation for both February and March. And so this graph, shows where things went over time. You see there in late January, early February, we were tracking drier than the two driest years in the historical record were at that point in time. You see the big improvement there in February and March with the dark blue line. And what's also shown, the other years shown on this graph are the most recent very dry and critical years. So the red line there is 2001, which is a very dry year, the driest year in the last, prior to this one, in the last 20 years. And the blue line there was the critically dry 2008, which was part of that 3-year drought. And then you see last year's 44.3 inches in the green, and how we had a very good start to that year and things just shut off after January. So that you can see there was about a 13-month period where we had record dry conditions starting in January of 2013 through January of 2014. So this year is those two, the 24 and the 77 represent those outlier years. The next bunching of years are, not quite as devastating, but still dry, and that seems to be now where we're tracking as far as this year is concerned. So another way to look at this information is again, looking at that initial plot from late January and where we sat at that point in time. And now, the improvements based on those February and March rains that we saw. So, we're now significantly above the outlier years, but we're still at the end of the line as far as the other years are concerned. So by no means are we out of the woods as far, still looking at a very, very dry year this year. So the San Joaquin, this is the San Joaquin Basin 5-station index for the Southern Sierra. It's not doing quite as well as compared to the Northern Sierra. So it's slightly better than those outlier years, but it's tracking a lot closer to the outliers than it is more of the typical dry years. So where did the improvements in the precip for the last 2 months go? Well, one place they did not go was in the snowpack. So our snowpack is still, especially for the Northern Sierra, is running drier than where we were in 1977. It's actually less than last year, which was a very low year for snowpack as well. A little bit better in the Central Sierra, so say from the Yuba system through, I believe that goes to the Stanislaus, or just north of Stanislaus. And then the Southern Sierra, not looking that great either. So where the additional precip, for the most part, it came in liquid form, and so it did improve storages significantly from where we were projecting back in January. So what we have shown here is the combined Shasta, Oroville, Folsom storages. The blue is the historical averages for each of those months, end of month storage. So that's January, April, and September shown there. So the blue is historical average. The red was the, for January, that was the actual combined storage as of the end of January, a little over 3 million acre feet for the 3 reservoirs. The dashed red for April and February was the forecasted storage at that point in time in January. So you could see that we were basically anticipating no storage gains from January through the end of April under a 90% exceedance hydrology. And you could see just a little over 1 million acre feet by the end of September is what we were projecting at that time. And that was insufficient storage. At those storage levels, the release capabilities would be so greatly diminished that we would not be able to repel the salinity. So that was the picture we were looking at from earlier. Now, the latest forecast based on April hydrology and April 1st snow survey, you can see, so in green, starting in April, that's our actual storages this year. So, big improvement from what we were projecting under the 90% in January. Still significantly short of historical averages. And now our forecast for the end of September is looking significantly better, although still very low compared to the historical average. So with the improved conditions, there have been some increased supplies available, certainly, as a result. We have scaled back the request for the modified Delta standards, and for now, the emergency drought barrier installation is on hold. So just to go back a little bit here on the drought operations plan. So our primary goals with the plan, number one was to address health and safety concerns, health and safety supplies for this year and for 2015. The second goal was to limit the salinity intrusion, and the emergency drought barrier was a big piece of that. Also, modifying the standards so that storage could be conserved in the spring, so it could be released to help with that repelling the salinity in the summer was another big part of that. We did take a look at several scenarios in the drought operations plan, even as of the plan based on March hydrology. In a 90% March hydrology, we still were planning for the installation of drought barriers under median conditions. We didn't feel we would need to go that extra step. And so indeed, with March being above average, we have put the emergency drought barriers on hold. Now, we continue to pursue the permitting, and the barriers continue to be a very important piece of the contingency planning moving forward. So, you know, that is still in our plan as we move forward. And of course, the next goal, very important on the conservation of storage, was for cold water pool for Chinook salmon. So that's, you know, we have seen, as I expressed in the last slide, some improvements, although it's you know, we're still hurting on storage. We have seen some improvements in that area as well. And finally, the goal for the drought operations plan was to provide, you know, flexibility in operations while still maintaining adequate protections for endangered species. And so that's what we've been working through as, you know, in the drought operations plan and through the RT dot. And battery may have gone, oh, there we go. So the next topic I'd like to pick up on is the actual operations. So in February and March, to a large degree, because of the fact that they were fairly wet, even though we asked for modifications to D1641, the unmodified standards ended up being largely met. There were some exceptions, and Diane made reference to this in her presentation. One of those was the opening of the cross-channel gates for the first 10 days of February, which is a significant departure from D1641. But as far as the X2 objectives, we ended up with only a little less than 5,000 acre feet of less outflow than would be required under the objective. So, you know, we show that 5,000 acre feet of less outflow. There were additional unquantifiable upstream benefits, though, as a result, and I'll get into that a little bit later here. In April, there was a little bit greater departure from what would be required under the X2 objectives. So there was about 210,000 acre feet of less outflow is what we're assuming now, is our calculations for the reduction in outflow as compared to X2 objectives in April. And so about 70% of that was, we look at that as upstream savings. There was about 30% of that we feel it was exported as allowed under the modified temporary urgency change petition of table 4 water. Okay, so what's table 4 water? So we were required to meet, or we did meet, the most basic level of X2 flow requirements at Collinsville. Those were met strictly through reduction of upstream releases. The modified TUC did allow for export of table 4, which would be some of the other X2 requirements further downstream, so at Chips Island in this case. And again, there were some additional unquantifiable upstream benefits. So what are these additional upstream benefits that I'm talking about? So there's significant uncertainty that's inherent in the system. And, so a lot of that's due to, for example, the long lag times of when we make release changes from the upstream reservoirs, 5-day lag from Shasta, 3 from Oroville, 1 from Folsom. We don't have any control over how much of that water actually makes it to the delta, how much of that is diverted before it makes it to the delta. So there's a lot of uncertainty associated with that in that aspect. For a lot of the salinity standards, the tides, winds can have a significant introduce a significant uncertainty as far as what salinity is and how we meet those standards. So operational buffers are necessary to ensure regular compliance of the standards. Historically, we've calculated we have met the standards 99%, greater than 99% of the time historically. But this level comes with a cost. So just to kind of give you, maybe help demonstrate this operational buffer issue. So you can see the red line there represents the unmodified flow standard. Typically, okay, so then we've got the range of uncertainty. In order to ensure that we're going to meet a flow standard, we need to target something above that standard, basically, to ensure that we will be able to meet it. So that's what I'm talking about here. This is how the 210,000 acre feet was calculated. So this new black line I've just introduced here on the slide is a flow under the TUCP order. And so that amount can easily be quantified. The difference between the unmodified flow standard and the actual flows that we ended up with as allowed under the modified TUCP. So what I'm referring to as the unquantifiable savings would be the fact that we also did not have to operate using this additional buffer that we would typically operate to in order to meet any particular standard. And I'll talk about this a little bit later as well when I talk about our further modifications that we're petitioning for going into the summer.
But didn't you have to do a buffer on the modified order?
The standards that we asked for, so for example, 3,000 outflow was a pretty low bar, and so with other natural flows in the system, we actually never came close to that.
You didn't have to augment.
So we didn't have to augment, right.
Thank you for explaining.
So latest petition requests. So in order to achieve additional savings for the upstream going in through the summer, one of the primary modifications we're asking for here is the movement of that Edmonton EC compliance point to the 3-mile slough. In order to achieve any benefits from moving that compliance point, we also needed to ask for modifications of the delta outflow for a couple months. Basically months where, for the most part, months where the requirement was not already at 3,000 CFS. So I think Diane went through that. In critical dry year, August, September, October are already at 3,000. And then the Rio Vista flow modification in the fall. It may be unlikely that we even need this Rio Vista flow modification, but better to ask for it, not need it, than the other way around. So forecasted operations, again, here is this concept of the range of outcome given uncertainty. So the way we really intend to operate with this this change in location for the EC standard on the Sacramento River, typically, as I said before, we would be targeting something higher than the standard in order to ensure compliance with the standard. What we intend to do with this modification, this will allow us to actually target Edmonton standard with no buffer. So this would be the savings that we would receive. So rather than targeting, say, the blue line to take into account the uncertainty, we plan to operate, it will allow us to operate more efficiently, tighter to the actual standard at Edmonton, knowing that because of the uncertainty, there will be periods of time where we will miss the target, and moving the compliance location upstream will still, we'll still guarantees we will meet the 3 Mile Slough, the requirement at 3 Mile Slough, even though we're targeting Edmonton with no buffer. So this is a combination of the lines represent the historical intrusion of X2 into the delta, and for the most part, the lines that intrude most upstream are the pre-project isohaline lines. So you see 31, 24, the 30 is very dry, 24 is very dry. The shaded area represents, that really goes back even further back than 1990, but that represents the periods where the projects, post-project, where we've basically controlled that salinity intrusion. The lines just outside of there represent the dry years since projects, where we have seen some level of salinity intrusion, most significantly 1977, 1988, 76. The boxes with the numbers, those are modeling for on the forecasted operations for this summer. So that represents the ECs that we are projecting. And this is actually somewhat conservative because this modeling run assumed we would be operating right to the 3 Mile Slough rather than operating more to Edmonton. So as you can see, some of these numbers, so for example, in the South Delta, near the export locations, a little over 700 EC, but that's, it's well below the standard of 1.0. I think, there's some concern by M&I folks on, some of these EC levels, but again, this represents probably more conservative based on operating right to the 3 Mile Slough, if that were the case. You can see the 903 at Rock Slough, which is would still be meeting the standard, and we would be also meeting our contract with North Delta Water Agency in that that's basically that standard is at 3 Mile Slough, and again, we would be operating more conservatively than that, as I indicated in the other slide. So we should not have an issue with meeting the requirement at 3 Mile Slough. And again, so just to go back to this one a bit, so as far as the no injury issue, so what the projects are really asking for is less release of stored water. We're not, impacting the natural flows that would have normally have occurred. So again, this would demonstrate that without the projects, we would expect salinity intrusion much further up into the system than with projects. The other last piece here on the plan moving forward is kind of the forecasted end of September storages. So again, I had them all combined in that bar chart that you saw previously, but right now in the forecast, this is the 90% forecast, the latest one from April, shows where we look to end up in each of the major reservoirs. Oroville above 1 million. And so these represent storages. These are all lower than we were going into this year, but that would be expected dealing with the type of year that we've had to deal with here. We do think it's adequate to meet the health and safety supplies for both this year and in 2015. But beyond that, you know, we have looked at various levels of dryness going into 2015. But as I said, these would be adequate for the health and safety needs moving forward. So that concludes the formal presentation. I think what I'll do now is just open it up to any of the other panel members if they wanted to make any additional statements. Thank you.
Great. If that's all right with my colleagues, might be good to have everybody speak, and then we'll have questions. Is that all right? Okay. Also, the animation's pretty impressive, I have to say, with the water flowing. I never noticed that before.
Maybe I'll start. This is Ron Milligan with Bureau Reclamation. And I just wanted to say a couple words about the drought operating plan that the agencies worked very, very hard on, and that includes staff from the board. We used that product for several purposes. Obviously, to try to create a framework to understand requests going forward for modification to objectives before the board, as opposed to doing something month to month, which was not optimal, but I would say that given the change in hydrology from January through February, March was probably something that was maybe necessary. I mean, a lot of planning, we were, as John pointed out, planning for the worst in terms of from going, if you saw February, March, what you were seeing in January or all through the fall, or for the 13 months prior to that, I think you would have had a different path than trying to manage this little bit of water above normal, at least in the Sac Valley, going through. So I appreciate everyone's working with us with that. But we did need something to think about the more stable period of later in the spring through the summer, setting up into next fall. So obviously, as it relates to a product to help us with our request to the board, were significant. We also had, for the operations of the two projects, Endangered Species Act concerns with inconsistency with, for DWR with the State Department of Water, Fish and Wildlife. And we used this as an analytical framework to think up through the effects on fisheries as they relate to our biological opinions, so that we could at least go through them in a consistent format. So in that context, I appreciate my colleagues from Fish and Wildlife Service and NOAA Fisheries in thinking through what those dynamics were as they relate to the biological opinions. So when we were making proposals to the board as they relate to standards, they could also be thought through as they relate to how we were managing for the species, the listed species, for both the effects on delta operations as well as some of our upstream operations, and how we were going to interact with all of that. And then try to figure out how we were going to meet some obligations to senior water right holders, and how we migrate to balancing that last piece that John had, was some storage at the end of September, and that sets us up in the event that dry conditions continued into next year. So that's kind of how we viewed the drought operations plan. It served a lot of purposes, and the work that we did going through that with, obviously we had input from a number of agencies, federal and state, which was very good and at very high levels. So I have to say that even director level input from the agencies had some value added in this particular case. So I think that was useful. So that's the product that you saw. And it's still a bit of a living document. Both projects continue as we get updates to hydrology to make modifications to our operational plans and temperature profiles in the different reservoirs, and move forward with this. So, and we've done a lot of work at Reclamation in terms of coordinating with our senior right holders on the Sacramento to modify their diversion patterns to try to improve conditions. But the drought operation plan served as a snapshot and at least a framework for us to make the modifications that we continue to do, but it's at a much smaller scale. So that's my 2 cents worth on the plan itself.
Good morning, Chair Marcus and members of the board. I'm Mike Chakowski. I'm the supervisor of the Bay Delta Fish and Wildlife Office, which is a field office located in Sacramento of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. My office's area of responsibility is really the legal delta, so we've been closely involved with the other agencies in discussions of water operations. I want to echo.
You might want to get a little closer, or just pull it closer.
Is that better?
Yeah.
Yeah, I want to echo Ron and John's expressions of appreciation for the level of cooperation among the agencies in addressing these issues. This has been a major challenge for the Fish and Wildlife agencies. The drought conditions that are affecting California are not only having an effect on human interests, but they've also been playing havoc with a number of native ecosystems and native species. And we've had to work hard over the last year to understand what those effects are, and in my office particularly what the effects of water operations might be in the presence of this overwhelming hydrologic drought. We have a basic expectation in drought circumstances that we're going to see reductions in populations of a number of species, and many of those things are unavoidable regardless of water operations. The service has actually had to address drought issues in a number of different areas. There's water project operations, which is the area in which my office operates. We also operate a set of hatcheries that produce salmon in the Sacramento Valley, and they've also been affected by the drought to the extent that we had to work with our partners on a fairly heroic fish trucking operation this year to move production of Coleman National Fish Hatchery down to areas where we would expect good survivorship. So it's been outside the box on that front. The service also manages a constellation of national wildlife refuges, including a number of them that are in the Sacramento and San Joaquin valleys. And it's been of paramount interest to us through all of this to ensure that there's enough water delivered to those refuges to support the large number of native species that rely on them, including millions of migratory waterfowl. So we've been working closely with our partners to achieve an outcome that will work for the fish and wildlife resources that are in our area of stewardship, while at the same time we've worked quite hard to find operational flexibilities to allow the delivery of as much water by the water projects as is possible. So again, I appreciate the level of cooperation that we've had from the other agencies, and I'm here to answer any questions that you may have.
I guess it's my turn. Morning, Chair Marcus, members of the board. My name is Garwin Yep. I am the branch chief for water operations, primarily operations of the Cedar Valley Project and State Water Project for National Marine Fishery Service, and I also oversee consultations, Section 7 ESA consultations in the Delta. So over the last 6 months, I would say that I've been drowning in the drought. It's been a pretty interesting experience. Back in 2008 and 2009, as we're developing our biological opinion that ultimately was signed on June 4th, 2009, we had a peer review of the draft biological opinion, and one of the comments from the panelists was, so we've considered a year of drought situations, conditions. Have we considered multiple years? So we went back to the drawing board. This was in December of 08, and going into June of 09, we had the 6 months to think hard about 1 year, 2 years, 3 years. Where do we stop? And what happens to the fish? What happens to the reservoirs? So we built in some things, one of which is the contingency plan requirement for Shasta operations, RPA Action 123C, that by February 28th, Reclamation and DWR shall provide a contingency plan if a Clear Creek temperature compliance point or 1.9 million acre feet carryover storage in Shasta is not met. So we started this process back in January, probably even before then, to talk about what can be done. And we needed to think hard about the whole system of the Central Valley Project and State Water Project, not just on Shasta. So we thought about the balances and sacrifices between everybody and everything. Our primary interest is on Winter Run being endangered, according to the ESA, and also one population downstream of Keswick Dam on the Sacramento River. So that's our primary focus. And as far as the 1.9 million acre feet end of September, do we provide that insurance policy for future generations of Winter Run? In this case, the cohort coming back in 2014 and 2015, or do we provide for the needs of the juveniles coming down the system now? And our best bet was to focus on this year and hope for the best. Mother Nature provide, what we hear is El Nino in the winter. But there's no certainty as to the future, so let's provide for the population that we have now. So throughout this whole process leading up till now, we're looking at Winter Run needs, considerations of the request for the DCC gate openings, and that would be a variation of our biological opinion, and also D1641. Should we open the gates? Could we open the gates? For how long? And what's the ramification for Winter Run? So we thought about that throughout the whole system. Of Winter Run migration coming down from Red Bluff all the way to Chips Island. In the development of the drought operations plan, if you look at the title page in the attachments, we explicitly focus one attachment D on Winter Run contingency plan because it matters so much to us. And it also fits in with J on Edgeman's fish monitoring and technology. So when we looked at Winter Run, we looked at dead pool at Shasta. How do we get water out of Shasta, and is there any cold water left for the summer and fall for Winter Run needs? Mother Nature provided, so now is the glass half full or half empty? We're looking at 1.1 or a little more end of September storage in Shasta. What we would require or like to have is 1.9, so we're considerably lower than that. And Ron mentioned this earlier, that in coordination and collaboration with the Sacramento settlement contractors, we're able to work with them to hopefully delay their depletions at Wilkins Slough in the order of approximately 130 to 150,000 acre feet of water that's conserved or saved in storage at Shasta, and also cold water for that, to provide for the needs of Winter Run during this season right now, where they're coming up to spawn and incubation of the eggs. Also, I think through this collaboration, at least GCID, if not all of the Sacramento settlement contractors, agreed to defer their rice decomp in October, which usually ends up in increased Keswick releases during that time, with the possible consideration of dewatering Winter Run reds, and of course we have fall run coming up at that time, and the water savings associated with that. So we're trying to balance all that. Back during the development of the drought operations plan, we were looking at no temperature compliance. Basically, temperatures at a Keswick reservoir would not be adequate for Winter Run throughout their season. So do we provide for the needs of